So, in actual fact, that's probably not what I should be doing, but I'll see how I can do this. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to actually I'm going to go through the book more than anything as a kind of an argument, because really what the book is an argument. It's an argument about the relationship between landscape architecture and gardening, and it's I'll talk about it as a piece of research, and obviously I've talked to you a bit about some of the ideas coming out of my PhD, but it's also useful to reflect on a little bit and talk about it as a piece of research since you guys are all going into dissertation, thinking about research questions and these kind of things. And so, as as a book, it comes from most pieces of research come from a gap. And so that's really what you're looking for in a project, probably too. In a research project or in something innovative, you're trying to find a gap. You try to find, like in your project, you're trying to find something which makes your project a bit different, a bit interesting. So as a gap, what this came from is a really big gap, which is that planting design and particularly maintenance is under theorized in landscape architecture. And this is a work of theory. So it's got a historical basis to it in some respects, but its primary contribution is not historical. Its primary contribution is theoretical. And it's important to recognize that, because in research you also want to recognize what your limitations are. And so the limitation I can say is that in my book I talk about a whole lot of case studies, and some of them have never been talked about in as much depth before, but they're not going to ever be authoritative accounts of those case studies because whole books could be written about them. I'm reading them in a very limited and specific way. So my claim is not that they are the most authoritative account. My claim is that I'm reading those projects differently. Now, there's a model of research for, this is written research, and I should say obviously it's a written thing, but as a piece of research, it's working on a model which is kind of known as argument building, which people like Chin would call argument building. And the way that works, if you think about a normal hypothesis situation where you make a hypothesis, you develop a methodology and undertake some tests and you evaluate results. That's the kind of scientific method. But when you're building argument, what you're doing is you're creating things where for instance, each chapter elucidates a point and all the points build towards the conclusion. And so it tends to be more polemic, where polemic means opinionated, etc. And that's why it's a piece of theory. So it's not, I'm not a doctor who's going to save someone on a plane. No. Now, in terms of what it's about, you'll see that there's in the title it says overgrown practices between landscape architecture and gardening, and so what's interesting about that, I think, is one of my key points is that I'm talking about the relationship between two different disciplines, which is landscape architecture and gardening. And there are a number of people here who've come from horticulture backgrounds who will appreciate why I might want to do something like that, because of the fact that landscape architecture has on the one hand, it's got a kind of class-based thing, which is that it's sort of like it's a white-collar profession, whereas to some extent gardening is a blue-collar profession. And that's indeed one of my arguments. And also because one of them is practiced in representation, as I talked about last week, and one of them is practiced in real time. And so the book is broken into two parts: figuring growth and gardening design, and they're in a way flips or mirrors of each other. And so when I talk about figuring growth in the first part, what I'm talking about is the idea that that on the one hand, and this is a key argument to my term which I've invented, which I'll talk about more, which is the veridic, that growth is what we work with. We don't work with plants, we work with growth. And plants, it's the same way that saying, we are humans, but the real thing we are is sort of cell division, growth, change over time. And so by calling what we're working with growth, I could be talking about wood, but I'm actually talking about growth as transforming physical material. And my whole argument is that for design is radical. because design is predicated, well, disegno is like the Italian term meaning drawing, but it's predicated on static form. That's one of the key things I'm arguing, whereas gardening is always working with dynamic growth. And so figuring growth is recognizing, figuring is a process where, for instance, in Gestalt theory, for example, a figure is something which has a sort of like a weight to it and a intensity to it. And I mentioned this before, that the key kind of figure is, say, the cross. It's a recognizable figure. And when we design landscape, a lot of the time what we're doing is we're figuring processes. So figuring being the act of producing a figure, drawing, giving form to something, which in this case is growth. And so the first three case studies work from, in a way, the perspective of landscape architecture as a design discipline, primarily, and then look about the relationship of landscape maintenance to landscape design. And the second part looks, and they're largely and mostly related to representation and drawing. The second part, on the other hand, looks about where if we take a gardening model, which is to say a real-time non-representational model, and treat those activities as design, what does that mean for what design is? And so, because in a way, if design is drawing, so in a way it's asking this question, is design drawing, partly? But it's also because in a way what I'm arguing is design is a type of judgment which picks up the formal in some sense, which looks to figuration, but is not only that. So one is to say drawing to outcome that is maintained. The other one is to say maintenance practice to design. They're both inverting each other. And so, and ultimately what I propose in the end is I propose a what's that there? Yeah, that's it. What happens in the end is ultimately I propose a manifesto for the veridic, which is this term which I've coined, as a way forward to try to suggest and anticipate some criticisms about my book, which I'll talk more about. Now, in the introduction, I'll just walk through some key orientating ideas. So what I'm using, again, focusing back on writing here, and you know, as a group of students, we've invested a lot of into you guys writing this semester, and I'm very pleased with the results of that. And so let's keep that dialogue going. And so in terms of the introduction, what it's doing is it's setting up ways of reading what comes later. And that's important. So what an introduction is often doing, it is setting in place key terms, setting in place ways of thinking, setting in place methods for what follows. And so if you're trying to write an introduction, on the one hand, the introduction towards the end summarizes and overviews the entire essay or thing, but the early part of it set in the reader's mind certain ideas that will help them interpret what comes later and the methods for it. Now, it's a book, so it's not actually an academic, it's not a thesis. I had to read a book that's a great book called From Dissertation to Book, and I worked for 3 years for actually only 1 year in the end. It took me 15 years to write the PhD and 1 year to write the book, and I ditched about half of the PhD to make it a book, because a book is a different thing. A book is about voice. A book is about your desire to read. A book does different things to what a dissertation does. So, in the introduction, and what I do in the book as a way of putting a reality to an idea, is I start each of the parts in the introduction with a little kind of a sort of a story. And so as you see, plan form, plant form. 2 rows of trees along a street form an avenue, creating a tunnel effect. For the driver passing in a car, the tree trunks produce a metronomic rhythm. For the pedestrian, the trees provide a cool refuge from the sun, a cathedral of branches from which leaves cast apple shadows far below that the walker's feet cross on the pavement. The Parisian tree-lined boulevard, the English country lane, the track lined by eucalyptus in the Australian outback, in all these avenue formulations, a recognisable space is created. A drawing of these configurations would use two parallel lines to guide the placement of tree centers opposite each other, pairs equally spaced along the line. This diagram is simple, providing no sense of the sophisticated spatial experience that the driver or pedestrian obtains. The space these trees form radiates from a uniform tree structure, but is much more than their location. And so what I'm doing there is I'm providing a key idea for the book, which is that the planting plan will never account for the growth of the plant. And that whenever we plant a plant, we're only planting and starting a process. And really the relationship between that avenue and a planting plan is so many miles away. Like that plant had to survive so much to get to that point. It's almost irrelevant where it was planted. It's not irrelevant, of course. It is a dynamic, and that's why I call it plant form, because a lot of the time I'm trying to find a dialogue between that action of placement and the actions of later of maintenance. And so in this chapter, and this is probably one of the most important things, is that I use the words form and space implicitly. Now, this is a weird tangent. It's one of my tangents and my sort of concessions to being in South Africa. Now, prior to coming to South Africa, I don't think I realised that space was as politicized as it is. And I think it's because in Australia and the way I was educated, there's a homogeneity about space. We don't realise in the same way in Australia and probably in the rest of the world that, for instance, space is not universal, that how people experience space is different, that we've talked about this a bit already, but I think it's really important because when we design something, really important for urban design, when we design something and make all these assumptions about something being good or bad and something defining a space, we're assuming always a viewer, we're assuming always a particular subject, and we're always making that subject the same as us in some way. And so the tools that are used to do it are form. And so we have this relationship between form and space. But that's a model, and that's a particular historical model, which I've talked about, which is around room. And it's important because I don't like the fact that I'm using terms that are so conditional, because I subscribe to the idea that space is political. But if I subscribe to that, how can I use these terms so formally? But if I don't use them formally, how can I talk about effects from planting design? Do you get the bind that I'm in? So I have to adopt a flawed definition, and I have to recognize and acknowledge that in the text for the question of rigor, because otherwise I'm acting like, if I sat here with Ian and Melinda and Fadley and we right now talked about space and I used this, rightfully they'd say to me, that's an incredibly formalistic way of talking about form and space. But if I don't, I can't make any of the findings that I'm trying to make. So it's just recognizing. That's almost like recognizing something. Now at the same time, what I do, the way I find my way out of that, and I hope you can pick up the building, the way I'm sort of building, I talk about also, for instance, the way that instead I talk about, obviously I introduce here the idea that the plant is a different type of form. So I say plant form is really plant growth, since the form of a plant at any given time has arisen because of growth. So you can't ever talk to the idea of form without talking about growth in plants. As soon as you cut it, it was alive to be able to respond to that cut. Anything that happens from a cut you make to the plant that's formal happens later from that cut, which it catalyzes. So you can't just talk about form. You have to talk about maintenance always. And so I also think about this idea about plants are growing form. So not only that is a radical idea. Imagine if you had a piece of architecture that was growing form. Imagine what the discipline of architecture would have to be. It would have to instead be regulating a material that was out of control all the time to keep it functioning. Imagine if you had the walls lengthening out, and suddenly the door frame cracks and falls out. It would it's nonsensical, right? But it tells you the idea about how important to design form being static is. So suddenly all of this stuff in landscape opens up as way more complex because you're working with materials where the entire space is transforming all the time. And so that's like a really crazy idea. And so what I do in this thing is I also talk about, this is where we're interested in a kind of interesting polarization, because most people who talk about growth and form are mostly talking about process. So as soon as the argument I'm saying is we're talking about form here, but we're talking about change, and you'd say in that case we're not talking about form, we're talking about process. We're talking about how things, processes of growth. Surely that's different from form. So therefore we've got rid of form again. But no, I want to talk about form. So how do I talk about form and process at the same time when I've already just decided that models of form don't work because this is changing? And so I move to this idea of Sanford Quinter's, which is what he calls manifest form, which is where he's actually talking about the idea as form is resonance and expression of embedded forces. And so what he really talks about is this idea of formation, which is that it's both the form and it's the process at the same time. So it's a process of formation. It's words, but I'm just qualifying these points of formalism. And so the next part is, this part that's called I call the biology of plant lines. The avenue is on a congested road in a tropical city, so the landscape architects select a large fig tree, Ficus religiosa, the tree under which Buddha is said to have gained enlightenment. They have seen massive examples of this tree, so they choose a generous spacing, 20 metres apart. When the trees are planted, they're only 3 metres high and 2 metres wide, leaving a space of 18 metres between them. This gap will close over in time, but each tree will have different shapes along the way according to their own morphological responses to site factors and its unique DNA. When the figs grow, while the figs will ultimately have large trunks and wide canopies, they will grow tall before they begin to spread. Since they are banyan figs, as the leaves spread sideways, aerial roots will drop down to the pavement and crack, finding water. Over time, across its lifespan, each tree will look like a dispersed network of trees rather than a single individual. And so what I'm referring to here is the idea that when you plant a tree, as a landscape architect, you project a uniform tree circle. You kind of go, mature, this is how I determine its planting. Mature, how big is it going to be at the end? Let's work to the end when we start at the beginning. Everyone would say that's the logical thing. But of course, we know that in actual fact, there are so many states between now and maturity that if we only privilege the one that they're going to be at the end, we're ignoring all the time in between. Imagine what that would be like if it were us as people. We're ignored until we're at this point. That wouldn't be right. But this is an organism we're talking about. This form we're talking about is an organism. It's alive. It goes through multiple states. So the provocation here is to think about what is tree form valued for every part of its life in design. So let's say, no, it starts off not as a tree. It starts off more as a pole, a fluffy pole. And so how do we design so that at the first stage we embrace its fluffy poleness, and then at its adultness we embrace its maturity, and each time we have an idea about what the design will do by embracing what the spatial effects of its intermediate forms are as a way of respecting its growth process, which is another implication. It means thinking about your design and how it works over multiple time periods as the plant changes. Now, it also recognises, and the reason I talk about this and I call the biology of plant lives, is I'm talking a lot of the time, almost exclusively here, about meristematic activity, which is to say, I introduce the idea that to talk about plants, you need to know biology. You need to know botany. And so if you want to talk about plants as form, if you want to talk about planting design, you have to talk about botany, and particularly you have to talk about plant morphology and plant physiology. And so I deliberately shove the language of biology into the language of architecture and say, how do they work together? And so in this chapter, I orientate the architectural reader to how the plant biology works in the book. And particularly I talk about these ideas about 3 factors in the development of plant architecture, which interesting is a word, plant architecture, that the biologists have given, the morphologists have given. Bud location, where the bud is located on the plant. Potential, the potential of that bud to produce a shoot, and time of activity. And so we have three different factors. And if you go back to the example of that situation where the person was mowing the garden, that's what they're working with. Potential of any, where the bud is located on the plant. So when you cut it, are there buds still available afterwards by how the maintenance technique chose to cut? Classic would be when you're pruning something and you remove the bud, fail, because the bud is where it's going to grow from. Once the bud is gone, it can't grow. So bud location. Second one, potential, which is the potential, both the potential of the plant of that bud to grow, but also the potential of what type of bud that will be. And the time of activity is when you do it. And so almost entirely in this book, all of the different formal outcomes come just from the manipulation of those three factors. And a lot of this is also talking about this stuff, apical dominance. So then I move on after I've introduced those languages to talk about this. And this is me, getting a bit, political here. The avenue is planted beneath overhead power lines. The trees have been steadily growing toward them, their top leaves now brushing against them. The council landscape architect has been working behind the computer, hasn't noticed, but a concerned ratepayer has contacted the council. The landscape architect is concerned that the power company will demand that the council remove trees in proximity to the lines. Meeting on site, the arborist dressed in high visibility workwear and the smart casual landscape architect survey the scene. Before returning to the office, the landscape architect directs the tree gang to prune the trees around the power lines. 15 metres in the air in a cherry picker covered in sawdust from the chainsaw. The arborist judiciously cuts some limbs and not others. As she carefully maintains shape and conceals cuts, the arborist's aim, based on her experience, is to cause the new growth to bypass the power lines. In this way, the avenue will continue to grow, with power lines growing through it until they eventually disappear and the avenue closes over. And so that's something we've probably all seen in good arborist practices. But it tells you that part of the story of that tree's final form in the mature circle diagram is going to be made by totally other people who are operating limbs and cutting things. So it recognises that there are other people in the story of any design, and their stories are generally not told. And this is a very big one for me personally, because of the fact that I would argue that that the gardener is the other, the other in the landscape architectural story, the quiet figure who any successful gardener we see, there's a gardener in the background who's been keeping it like that, and their stories are never ever told, and they're not recognised in the process of design because it valorises the designer always. And so what I do here is I talk about the etymology of the term landscape architect and really argue that the roots of landscape architecture are in gardening. And so the way, it's quite easy to do because of the fact of that landscape architecture came from landscape gardener as a way of operating. And so I really walk through the language of that and look at how the American Society of Landscape Architects started as being called the American Society of Landscape Gardeners and moved over to be landscape architects as part of an international process by which people professionalize disciplines. And so that professionalization is a process that happened all over the place. And so I talk also about how gardening is not recognised as a skill in, for instance, most of South Africa and also in the US, and is generally given to as part of a class-based system. And so I talk about that. And I also try to work with oral history. And finally, and this is one anticipating a big problem in my approach to research, which is to say, landscape architects have always asked me this question in relationship to my research, which is, why are you talking about gardens when public landscapes are in desperate need of care? It's a very, very reasonable question. And what they're asking me to do is to instrumentalize my outcomes into ways of practice. And I think that's a really reasonable thing to do. But it ignores the fact of what I'm really trying to do here, which is that I'm using the garden to test and develop these theories because it's a controlled context. Insofar as the garden has had a long-term ownership It's got a certain care about it. I can talk about and find information on it, and it's subject to a lot less vagaries than the public landscape. And so once I started talking about the public landscape, how would I talk about the fact that at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night, some pissed drunk been spewing on this tree for about 10 years, and now its levels of pH have gone through the, like, I can't get that in there. So, those kind of things are quite important. And also there's a history in landscape architecture about testing in the garden and using the garden as a test space. And so in a way, this is me acknowledging that there's a kind of a problem, but also that the gardens are also a creative place, which is something I also look at. So that gives you the kind of I've got three main ways of thinking in this: the relationship between plant growth and form, the idea of botany as a language, and the relationship of maintenance and design. So, okay, figuring growth. Now, I'm very unhappy with this as a page in between this and the next page, but this chapter, Persistence of a Line, and it's a useful thing to look at Mike's diagram here, which, when I asked Mike to make this diagram, what I was saying, and this sort of demonstrates, is that we're actually talking about different practices of gardening being applied to different pieces of geometry to create different sorts of spatial outcome. That's what that is. And it's trying to present the French garden as an algorithm as compared to presenting the French garden as a kind of like a thing about taste or a thing about, etc. And so I think that the garden I talk about is this garden Courance, and it's an extremely beautiful garden, and we'll talk about it quickly, and I'll use it as a little bit and also talk about the garden a little bit. But one of the things I talk about here is this idea of how the story of the French garden is generally told in relationship to optics, and I gave you guys that reading, Anamorphosis Absconditus, last year about the use of perspective in the garden. But in actual fact, what I found was the most interesting thing in the garden when I visited Vaux-le-Vicomte, and I always start each chapter, I've got another meta-narrative which I'll talk to you guys about, is that part of what I'm arguing in this book is that there is a story of landscape which has been untold and has been eclipsed by landscape urbanism, and that there was a period of research in the 1990s and 1980s that has been abandoned because landscape urbanism came along, and it's the crux of between postmodernism and modernism. And so all the way through, I reach back to that period to locate this research in that historical continuum. And that's the continuum of people like Beth Meyer, the continuum of people like Stephen Krog, the continuum of people like Dorothée Imbert, and all these scholars. And so in the garden, it's that thing where the discourse of the garden was always about that perspectival kind of view of Vaux-le-Vicomte and the relationship between particularly that as an anamorphic site and the concealed cross axis, for example. And so there's all of this perspectival stuff going on here. And instead what I did was I found is that I was left cold, but what really fascinated me was this particular edge here. And interestingly, this is the edge that I first visited in 1995, and then I visited again 10 years later, and it's sort of still the same. And so when we look at this edge, what we're seeing how a big piece of territorial geometry, a piece of geometry that's a big piece of geometry that's hydrological, tied into a hydrological system, and at the same time, as this diagram shows, at the same time it's got this massive monumental figure, that geometry is actually being mediated over a series of different time intervals. And so, for example, while this is a kind of configuration, this form is made via a series of these practices. And so if we look at this is where there's a section here which is vital. And I use a lot of sections in this chapter, which is there is the transverse canal, then we have lawn, then we have path, then we have a row of trees, then we have a hedge behind, and then we have regeneration. And so this is actually a process of transition between two different ways of life. On the one hand, that way of life here is about natural process. The forest has to grow into a forest. It has to be a forest. It has to do forest things. It has to have forest species. It has to be a natural system to be able to produce large-scale wood in that way. It's an ecosystem. But along here, what's happening is that there is a transition which is about maintaining the separation between those systems, where on the one hand, the tree provides a long-term thing. So once this here gets removed as forest, that tree remains. So those trees keep making up this persistent line. And then this hedge here is effectively acting as camouflage and spatial separation and maintenance separation between that space and this space. It's also prohibiting that space from moving into this space because it's mown with a tractor. These bits are mown probably with hand mowers, and this is cut with powered clippers probably. And so it's a tool to maintain those two different territorial regimes. And that was the thing that interested me when that was what I was supposed to do. And I found that was the start of the whole thing. So what I talk about from that is this term that is really bad in French. It's just a term that and so all the French scholars recognize that it's okay that I've created this new term, but they really don't like it. And so the term I'm referring to is parti parterre, and it refers to this idea that the parti pris in modernism was this thing about a drawing that summarizes an idea. And so the parti in architecture is, again, the figure of the cross, or the parti diagram is the most simplified way you could draw a design. And it's sort of, they call it, it comes from parti pris or point parti, pardon me, which is to take a position. And so it's interesting that this is that term, and it's been even though it came up during the Beaux-Arts, it's been a major part of modernism. And so on the one hand, that term is a big scale thing. So at Versailles, the parti is the cross. That's what it is. In the French garden, the parti is always the cross. The same way as in the French park or the French square or the English park in most colonial countries, the parti is always the Union Jack. That's just the way it goes because it's also got some logic. Centre to centre, corner to corner. I mean, it's the parti that you will find at a colonial park. And so at the same time, the parterre de broderie is a detailed hedging configuration. And so this is where the term, by putting them together, what I'm talking about is that there's a relationship between the overall diagram and the detail that sits inside that diagram. And so if we use an example here, what we find is that, for instance, here is Versailles, and in a way this is roughly speaking the parti of Versailles, and then inside that is a parterre inside there. So in other words, that's an autonomous design. That's an autonomous piece of spatial organization sitting inside a territorial hierarchy at this scale. Similarly, if we talk about which one is this one? I must have it in the caption below. Hang on. I should remember my own. Is that Currance? I think it might be Currance, actually. Oh, gosh. Is it Vaux? Yeah, so this is Vaux le Vicomte. And so this is where, we're talking about different, I don't know, I think that this needs to be changed around because that actually has to be against that. And so again, we can see how there is this territorial organization of the parti and this interior. In a way, it's an interior. It's like the inside of a box. It's like its own individual space. And this is something that continues to happen, and that's Parc Citroën, you know. So all of them demonstrate this sort of principle. And I think it's a basic principle of landscape, but one of the most useful things that you can get for landscape, because don't forget, landscape's big thing is negotiation of scale. And so that's always our most interesting and most difficult thing. How do we mediate between human scale, visual scale, etc., and territorial systems? And so this partie parterre model I'm talking about, which is the French Garden has, which is a large territorial organisation with smaller spatial infills that are around the scale of a person, is a major tool. And it also is a maintenance activity, which is an argument I'm making. And so when I talk about territory, I'm using the term in the way that Michel Courageux uses it, which is territorial as territory as a kind of milieu of natural and social forces operating over time. Very different from the kind of Anglo-Saxon colonial idea about the indigenous. And so one of the key things I look at in this case study is around what I call the blurred axis, which is the idea that over time, the geometry, while a partie has stayed the same, the parterre and the detail configuration has changed radically. So on the one hand, the figure at territorial scale has stayed the same, but the infill on the ground due to growth has changed over time. And so I put together, I mean, this is my, let's have a look at that drawing and see what the line weights and stuff turn out. And so what I ultimately look at is how over different periods of time and different maintenance regimes, the form of this allée d'honneur, which is the way the way into the French Garden often, which is an alley of honour, which goes into before you meet the moat and then the moated mansion. I look at all of the different configurations it had and what the different spatial outcomes of those were over time. And so I show how it's still the partie is the same, but otherwise the geometry over 400 years is flexing really radically. In a way, if you're talking about a plan, the idea the plan is fixed. The plan is not fixed. It's only fixed if you refer only to the architectural component. The landscape component is very dynamic in that sense, you know, and also changes due to maintenance practices. And in this whole section, I look at these different periods and how the different fashions of dealing with plants changed during those times to spatially redefine what the different spaces were made up of. And finally, we get to these trees, which are the same reason I came there as somebody told, there was something talking about these beautiful old trees. The reason that they result from that process is that they weren't pruned for 150 years because of revolution, social revolution. And so what happened is that ultimately those trees were first not pruned during the French Revolution. Then there was discrepancies around ownership for about 100 years. And then the Second World War happened, and they were a military camp for the Americans, the Germans, and then the Americans. And so when the owner, who's the father of the current owner, came along, these trees already had this shape. And so so we can only speculate upon what the original idea about the trees were. But when they were planted towards the end of the Baroque period, they certainly weren't planted to be naturalistic. These trees could be coming from an English landscape garden. And it's because once the tree started to grow and go old, you had two choices: keep it and prune it, working with its existing form, or take it out and start again. Because once the die is cast in growth, you have to work with what emerges. And that's one of the most interesting things about growth. It's like, that's why I often use this sort of jazz analogy, which is you're working with an emergent structure. That once the band is playing something, your only solution is to work with what's happening, but then you take part in an activity which may change the form of what it is. So after that, I then talk about the other parts. So after showing how this form, which seems fixed, has actually been dynamic and contingent, I then move around and I talk about the idea that the edge between the garden and the landscape, it's not about the garden being it's not about the garden, it's about the forest and the management of the edge of the forest, basically. And I look at the way that a range of different edge conditions are found in this garden and different maintenance techniques used to make them as a kind of typology of edge conditions. And so this includes doing things like finding holes in hedges, looking behind what hedges are, doing strange drawings, and ultimately what I was looking at was the way that these different approaches shape the edge, and the way that those approaches then inflect the overall garden space. And so some of this is quite detailed, but it's really looking at those typologies. And in this process, what its real meta thing is doing is it's trying to open the reader up to the idea that this is much more than simply a line on a planting plan, that this is actually a dynamic maintenance process. It's trying to open up the idea that there can be, that you could see something like, that you could find something like that interesting, and why that's an interesting configuration and a way of controlling things. And so when for the design guys, when I'm talking in studio about, wanting, this is a Jess, probably for you, Jess, a little bit, and maybe for you also, Dirk, when we talk about, I'm talking about working with the normative, what I'm talking about is being interested in how the same element is able to be utilized in different ways. So that could be a hardscape element or a typology of different elements, And so it's about trying to say in a park, and this is something one of my teachers, Peter Connolly, used to do in his studios, which was there's only 3 materials: bitumen, grass, and trees, one species of tree. And we had to do studios with only those 3 materials. And that was super useful because it meant that you were always working with topography, you're working with circulation, you're working with plants as space makers, And so it's about trying to unpack that language and looking at the different hierarchies. And ultimately what it was looking at was the way that intensity of, basically if we go from the beginning here, what we're looking at is how the most intense maintenance treatment is always the closest to the building and is operating more in terms of a gardening paradigm. And then as you move away from that, you start to move into the zones of machinery, much bigger machinery. And so this is basically a machine with an arm on it, and you can see the height of the arm along here in terms of how high the arm can actually get in terms of pruning. And then, moving into where, this is an example of how a new forest is being produced. And this is quite an interesting method, right? So in this forest, what they were doing is they were mowing a grid. And so what they're doing with a slasher mower, and so, for maximum surface control. And so what they're doing is they're basically dragging it through on a grid, and anything that comes up in between, they're making decisions about it. So they're working with regeneration inside the grid they've created. So that basically once you've got that grid, if, say, a lime tree comes up, they'll just cut everything else out and they'll let the lime tree start to grow, and then they'll actually then change the grid a little bit to move out to mow in between. And so in the way what they're doing is selecting from regrowth, that process. But again, we can see that edge here. Here's the row of trees and here's this edge, and you can see what it's doing in relationship to these, to the sense of formality about those two landscapes. You can see on this side we've got fine grain mower, bent grass, this here we've got a very fine edge. But have a look at what's happening in this material and have a look at what's happening in this material, and you can tell that this is mown. You could do an algorithm that says that this is mown much more frequently, this is cut twice the interval of that, then this is like 4 times the interval, and this is like twice a year. So when we're imagining that as a diagram, we're talking about multiple intersecting time intervals. And so when you then move into the other areas, again, this is basically just mowed. This is just mowed as a material. That's the only approach here. They've got a grid of trees, but then just one gap is mown. And then when you move in here, probably all you've got is actual walking and the vehicles themselves going through there that are keeping that from being as it is, and the dynamics of the path that's created. So it's like radially from the center, the practices are changing the form of things. And so that paradigm really is focused on the idea of talking about how historic great landscapes that we might think of are really not as static as we think, and are actually entirely about processes that happened in time. Like, the whole story of that garden is about actually the story of the loss and gaining of wealth. It's like some aristocracy was high. Like, if you read the records, which I talk about in there, the amount of times that place sent people down the tube over time is crazy. So even though these are, aristocrats, etc., they've got this thing, and it's one generation after another takes it on, adds something, loses a lot of ground. Next generation tries to take it on. There's a revolution. They get their head chopped off. So the fact that there is even a persistent line in this landscape is an amazing thing. So when we get to this next chapter is called The Architecture of Plants, and it really pulls out the most basic paradigm of planting design we know, which is to utilize what I call plants as an analog for architecture. And so it's called Architecture with Plants because basically the argument is that it's really just architecture, but the material they're using is plants. So it's one approach that we know. And I talk here about this most famous of things, the honey locust alley at the Miller Garden by Dan Kiley. And I talk about, it's a logical link to talk about this after talking about the French garden, because Dan Kiley was a nut for French landscape. So that's my segue into this chapter. And in it, I look at this project, which was by Eero Saarinen and Dan Kiley in relationship to the architectural analog. And this is this plan, which is the sort of famous sort of plan by Kiley that they refer to often. They call it a sort of pinwheel plan, because it's got this sort of handle, and then it's got all of these areas. And as you can see, this is the language of the building, which is 4 pavilions underneath a roof. And the landscape operates utilizing the same grid often, and utilizing the same spatial structuring operations as the building. And so it's an analog also because Kiley would say straight away that the project was, he calls it's his most modern of, most modern, and it's led by the architect. So Kiley says the house was designed in functional blocks, so I took the same geometry and made rooms outside using trees and colours. So it's a piece of modernism, and a lot of people have talked about it as a piece of modernism. And also what they do a lot of the time is they utilize the language of architecture to describe the plantings. So that they're described, as a grid of columns, they're described as a grill. So all the terminology, the canopy is described as a ceiling. So all of the analogies used to describe the landscape are actually architectural analogies. So I look at what analogy is, which is where something is similar to something else in a certain sort of way. And I look at and demonstrate how all of these different models of talking about the garden. I mean, there's an early CAD AXO of the planting design, and you can tell if those are trees, they're not, they're trunks, right? So and they're utilizing an extruded kind of polymer framework. And so I look at all of those sort of things, and then I try to look at how plant forms during modernism of the type that were used by plant types that were used by Dan Kiley were actually all of them presupposed plant growth. So while the modernists opened up the whole language of plants in terms of form, and this is these drawings, I don't know if you've seen these before, by James Rose, but Rose develops this kind of typology where he talks about plants in terms of being, columnar, pendulous or weeping, round or oval. So in this sort of taxonomy, what he's doing is he's trying to show how the modernist language can be utilized by demonstrating that plants have the same form as modernist forms in architecture. So he's in a way pulling in modernist architecture. Part of it's a desire to move landscape into the realm of modernist architecture, and part of it's the fact that by this generation, the idea of space and form has taken over and is now the main driving thing. And so what I'm really arguing, though, is that whenever you're talking about that the garden, is that when you're talking about planting design, you're always talking about maintenance. As I say, that I'm talking here about the relation to French gardens, and I say the formal garden was always a work of gardening. But while the French were interested in maintenance technique as a way of making space, the modernists were specifically uninterested in that because they were busy differentiating themselves from gardeners to be treated seriously by architects. And so they have ultimately threw away the idea of the gardener as they rejected the past. So what I really demonstrate in the rest of this chapter, which is important because of the fact that it demonstrates that, what I'm trying to demonstrate anyway, is that the kind of idea we have about that alley, when you go over historical photography, what you discover was that the alley was never static. And so while people talk about it like it's a piece of architecture, like it's always functioning in this way of columns, like it's fully mature they always talk about it like it was fully mature all the time, like it was fixed in how it operates, because they're talking about it like a piece of architecture. And so when they say what's interesting is that it's done of plants, they're not buying into my idea, which would be plants are about growth. They're instead about trying to maintain a static sense of form. And so what I look at over time and discover is that to maintain that static form, they had to constantly be replanting things. So what you'll notice if you start to look at trunk sizes is that they were constantly removing trees and replacing them with mature trees to maintain that effect, because they were having ecological problems in terms of pathogens and with the trees. So once in this avenue, once one plant gets an infection, it's like gone through the entire lot over and over. There's problems with implementation in terms of how this was built. And so ultimately that avenue had to be replaced 3 times over its life. So instead of it being a fixed thing, always celebrated as an icon of planting design, in many respects, it was a failure of planting design and if anything, a win of gardening to try to keep it going for as long as it was going. And so instead of it being a fixed thing, it's actually revealed as being hugely dynamic. And now this is the most recent replanting. And in the end, they decided to replant it from scratch, recreate the entire terrace. But they kept the entire planting placement, even though the planting placement is one of the problems with how it was actually, with how it performed. And so that's just an example of how the story of gardening maintenance is implicit to any story of highfalutin landscape design in modernism. There's always a backstory, in a way. And so this section is really one of the key ones because of the fact, this chapter on Marnas, the Marnas garden, because of the fact that this is where I focus this idea about the viridic. And so I alluded to this garden before, but I'll go through it again, which is that this guy Sven Ingvar Andersen, who is the landscape architect in this garden, is extraordinary Danish landscape architect, because Denmark, and you will have seen that I've shown you this, talked to you this about a number of times, this image, and why this image is, for me, an example of the best kind of planting design you can do. But, Sven Ingvar Andersen was a really major part of the Danish landscape scene, and Denmark is a major player in landscape architecture. And so what I look at is this garden called the Marnas Garden by Andersen. And he worked on this garden since the 19 sort of really, it was even the 1950s. Oops, I can't remember right now, but for at least 40 or 50 years. And so when the garden was first planted, it was actually established around this parti diagram, but it became much, much more complex over time. And so what I do in this chapter is I talk about the dynamic between space creation in plan and maintenance action to change spaces over time without changing the plan. Now, the reason why that's an important idea is because my argument is that if you don't account for gardening, that there's certain spatial outcomes in landscape you can only get if you actually work as a gardener. And so this is a good example of that because the planting plan is the same, but the spaces are different from the spaces that were created when the planting plan was made. How is that possible? Only through gardening. So it's again part of my argument. And so I've talked earlier about this idea about planting plan as specifying the location, but in a way what I'm actually, and this is where I've got to ask you guys a question, horticulturalists. So do you guys know, we know Buxus, right? Do you know hawthorn as well? Is that Buxus or is that hawthorn? It looks like Buxus, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. No. Just that thing where I'm trying to actually, it does look like Buxus to me. And so I'm going to have to, in my revision, have to change this because I'm hoping that it was hawthorns. But that's what happens when you get archival photos. You discover that it's actually not what you thought. So I'll change that. And so in the chapter, what I'm demonstrating is this dynamic between design and gardening as a space creator. And in particular, this is where I unpack and develop my idea about the veritic. So I'm going to go into this in a little bit more depth. And so when I'm talking about this language for plants, probably, as was pointed out by Francis Carter in this room, when I presented my earliest research on this book and discussed this veritic, he said, why are you putting the veritic as like a little footnote? It's probably your biggest contribution is going to be that term. And so why don't you foreground that term? And so with that in mind, what I'm trying to do is to develop a form language for plants, really. And the reason that's important is because until you think about something as a form language in some sense, it's actually difficult to treat it as design. And this, I think, is a big problem for planting design. A lot of the time, planting design is treated either in this sort of weird painterly way or with really boring sort of models like, texture and form, or it's treated in this botanical way as a kind of exercise in plant mixing, or it's developed in this formalistic way of space making. But how do we bring all of those things together? And I argue they have to be brought together via growth. And so when I talk about James Rose's taxonomy, what I say is that his taxonomy is good, but he was ignoring both growth and the role of gardening. And so Meyer used, this partly built on Meyer's work, and a lot of my work builds on Meyer's work. And I think that's something to acknowledge in this meta way of us talking about research. We build on the shoulders of others. That's not a bad thing to our originality. That's an honor. That's like you always build on someone else. So the literature review part is not about trying to prove that you're well read. The literature review part is to try to help. It's like the next step up a ladder before you put in the next step on top of it or something. You're building on it, right? And so I'm actually taking up something that Meyer suggested, which is that landscape architects should embark upon a consideration of plants equivalent to Clement Greenberg's analysis of modernist painters. Now, Clement Greenberg was an art historian, an art theorist, a modernist art historian, and he was working from the work of people like Jackson Pollock and the abstract expressionists, and was looking at what he referred to as in the analysis of modernist painting, where artists sought to exploit the specific properties and logic, and this is the most important thing, and logic of their medium, which he called medium specificity. Now, I always liked the idea of that. Like, if we're landscape architects, shouldn't we have medium specificity about plants? I mean, that's our medium. We should be better at it and know more about it and have an approach to it. Now, if we're always just appropriating models from other discourses, how are we ever in control of our own media? And so the fact that the language has been under-theorized is like a big gaping opening, right, sitting there waiting for me to fill it. And so, and so what he talked about in here in Modernist Painting, which is one of his most important essays, and that the artists in the room will, I'm sure, have read way too much Clement Greenberg in their time. And so, in Modernist Painting, he says that, medium specificity describes the taking possession of a narrow area of competence by determining through its own operations and works the effects exclusive to itself. And so that's to say that in a way, if we look at Jackson Pollock, to a certain point, Jackson Pollock's work was about paint, and it was about canvas, and it was about movement and his physical actions. And so once the figurative has disappeared, suddenly the canvas is revealed as canvas, paint is revealed as paint, and technique changes from being a tool to represent something else to being the thing itself. And this is when people talk in architectural terms about the tectonic, they're using it in exactly the same way. It's an interest in structure. It's an expression of an interest in structure, where the aesthetic of the building is the aesthetic of its construction. And so what I look at really here is that I try to work from this by looking at a number of other sorts of things. And so I also refer a little bit to some of the writing of Rosalind Krauss, where she came up with a slightly different term for medium specificity, which is that she came up with this idea of what she called the rules of the guild, but we'll come back to that in a second. And so there's an interesting thing here that comes from this model because to some extent, like Rosalind Krauss would argue that the discipline of architecture doesn't produce buildings, it produces drawings. And so the buildings get used by someone else to produce buildings, but its disciplinarity is the production of drawings. And in a way, it's true. The drawings are a proxy, but the drawings are not the building itself. And so, to some extent, the same is true of landscape architects. But there can be a level of trust between the architect and the sense of what's represented in construction that can't always be had in landscape. So when the builder has something being built from, when the architect has something built from a set of drawings, there might be defects, there might be, the shoddy contractor might not end up putting the proper waterproofing behind the wall because nobody was on the site to observe whether they used it or not. But other than that, the wall's going to be in a wall, it's going to be made of a certain material, there's a level of trust, there's a kind of tolerance, etc. Now, the same is not true in landscape. Whenever you plant something, whether or not it's going to survive is a big, big question. And I can say that most designs that focus around plant material fail because maintenance is impossible to really regulate currently. And that's a big issue and why landscape architecture moves more and more towards bomb-proof plants and more towards the idea of the static in architecture. So we'll use buddleias and we'll use, maybe we won't even use buddleias, but we'll use agapanthus, we'll use the same series of plants because we know that they are bomb-proof, that they're going to perform. Doesn't mean we have to like them, but out of the whole bunch, we at least know that they're going to look like this in X many years' time. Pretty pessimistic way of working with your material, right? And so this is where obviously I'm arguing for a rapprochement between these things. Now, I also have this thing where at the same time gardening is non-representational and immediate. So while the landscape architect produces a planting plan, it's actually working with, the action of gardening is not non-representational. And so therefore, I argue that if we take Greenberg's suggestion that we should determine gardening's medium specificity through its own operations and works and effects exclusive to itself, from that comes a kind of formula about how we might approach medium specificity in plants. Now, you guys have all just read Ferrari, and so I won't go into too much depth, but in actual fact, obviously, when we're talking about, about the operations and works of Greenberg, what we're talking about in a garden equivalent is working with planting techniques such as soil planting, pruning, tending of plants, propagating, etc. They are the work. They are the thing itself. And so, obviously I talk about, Ferrari's ideas because also I'm always pushing the idea that it's interesting that it's a material, that plants are a living material. And so what we're really talking about then is a model that both brings together the real-time, non-representational actions of gardening and the representational drawing of design. How do we bring those two things together? How do we work with them together in a language? This is where, going back to Krauss, she has an interesting change. Now, Krauss, and again, a lot of, everyone who's been involved with art will have read a lot of Rosalind Krauss. But, she had a brain tumor. And during her process of getting over it, she wrote a book called Under Blue Cup. And it's very interesting because what she talks about is this idea where she moves to this idea that the medium is the memory. And she insists the power of the medium to hold the efforts of the forebears of a specific genre in reserve for the present. Now, for me, that would really define my approach to history, which is I'm not interested in history for understanding the politics of what happened in the 17th century or the 16th century. I'm interested in the power of the medium to hold the efforts of the forebears of a specific genre in reserve for the present, which is you use history. You willfully use history. It's why I don't teach history as history, really. I teach it more as studies of projects. It's probably why, I know Maria has occasionally been frustrated by my lack of facts in history, I think sometimes. But, because I'm a lot focused on here is what I'm reading into this because it's in reserve for the present. Whereas Greenberg's idea is trying to tie it to the physical substance. And so this idea she talks about as the rules of the guild is a really useful thing because, I think that that the rules of the guild is probably one of the main things. And so this is where I also argue and introduce the idea here that that the location of plants in relationship to each other creates a calibration between them, which the gardening techniques interact. So a lot of the time, and most of the time, you're in a reaction between the internal and the external. And Science Jess, this will remind you a little bit of what you've been reading in relationship to protein and DNA. Not protein and DNA, protein and what is it? Cell division? No, I can't remember. Anyway, basically that there is an internal imperative within the plant and there is an external environment that the plant reacts. And there's a dynamic between those two because there's a latent response in the DNA, and for mutation to occur, something has to either happen in the environment something has to happen in the environment that has something latent in the organism that the organism can favour. I don't know if that's roughly right. So therefore this is the same thing where the plant is always in that dynamic relationship with its environment. And so when you're gardening, you're always mediating the relationship between the plant and its environment, which is also made up of the other plants. And so they are interacting with each other as an ecology. So you're maintaining an ecology in relationship to individuals. And as Ferrari would say, every garden is important than every plant, because you'll sacrifice a plant for the sake of the garden. So it's as he says, it's a totalitarian government, the plant, and so I also try to keep working with this thing. Now, okay, here's to the guts of this concept, which is really this idea of plant tectonics. Now, it's an incorrect term because the tectonic is a really specific thing. But when I use the term plant tectonics, what I'm referring to is the idea that the tectonic has this role for architecture. When people talk about it's very tectonic, they're talking about how it's made. They're specifically asking, how it's made, and if they see it in the design, that will also lead them to understand the design in a certain sort of way. And so I developed this by developing this thing called the veridic. And so, in his book, Frampton's book, The Studies in Tectonic Culture, That book seeks to mediate and enrich the priority given to space by reconsideration of the constructional and structural modes by which it has been achieved, calling the tectonic a poetics of construction. And so in this sense, the ambition of architecture is tied to how it's made. Now, in a way, when I talk about plant tectonics, what I'm doing is a similar thing, but I'm trying to, hang on a second. I'm trying to tie space making to gardening, using gardening to work with the change of plants due to the growth in fulfilling landscape architecture's space making ambition. Now, I stick with Semper because I think he's a really interesting guy. Now, when I stick with him because because of one simple thing, which is that he was interested in the way that a material was used and the relationship of that material to the form of the outcome. And so he would say that in a way that, for instance, when you're talking about what you're talking about how a building is made, for example, you're talking about, in this model, on Semper's model, if you're talking about the tectonic, you're talking about timber, you're ultimately talking about the carpenter, you're talking about a particular range of tools, you're talking about certain things that can be done with timber. When you're talking about stereotomy, I can never remember the right term. What is it again? Stereotomy. You're talking about the earthwork. You're talking about stone. You're talking about stonework. When you're talking about wall, you're talking about, for him, it's this sort of model of architectural evolution. You're talking about the tent. You're talking about fabric. You're talking about weaving. And so the material, its final form, is mediated via the conventions of how it's manipulated. That's originally what he meant. So you can't talk about the form separate from the process of its manipulation, which means the person who's doing the manipulation is implicit. The carpenter is implicit. The weaver is implicit. The stonemason is implicit. And therefore, for the veridic, I argue the gardener is implicit. And so when it comes to this, what I'm really, I go into a little bit more, but I say, from Semper, when he undertook to understand the work as a result of the material used to produce it, as well as the tools and the procedures applied. And so this is where, for me, we're now opening up the idea of procedures, pruning, planting, mostly pruning. I say truthfully in this book, it's mostly about pruning. So when we move into the veridic, what I really look at is I try to come up with this word. And so the word I refer to and how I get there, actually, I have to thank Michaelis for this, because a lot of my book was actually produced in the Michaelis library, because it's a really quiet place to work, and it's got those big monitors, and mostly produced during breaks there. And so there was a book called, in the new bookshelf, that was called A History of Colour. And each volume of it had a different colour. And so I picked up the green colour. And so I have to, if I have to give credit to that. And so he explores this idea of the Latin name for green, which is virent. And so, and in the English term green, and similar to the English term greenery, vegetation was always called virentia. And so this is where you can start to see where veridic is coming in here, because it's nice, because it's tied to the colour green, then it's tied to plants, and then it also talks to the idea that, in actual fact, that the term green also denotes growth, which is viridesco. So it's the best term I could possibly have. It's got the colour, it's got the material, and then it's got the word growth all tied into the one term. And so that's how I end up with the term veridic, because it's just it gets to growth, it gets to the plant, and it gets to this sort of the colour, the kind of brand of vegetation, And so this is where I then use the Semper model to say, if we produce according to Semper's model, then the material and the procedures to manipulate it are tied to it, tied to the form, all three of those things. So the modernist thing about separation of construction from, or separation of the role of construction from, or the builder from the work is abolished, and I keep the procedures the form and the material all tied to each other around the idea of growth. So that's, in a way, that's probably the main thing. And so when I go through this chapter, if we go through it, which I call pruned space, the main thing that I'm working on with it is I'm discussing how the spatial outcomes changed without a change in plan to demonstrate the planting plan can't be our only metric. We have to have the veridic because we have to have a way of getting both design and technique. And this is easily argued here because, in 1982, this was the shape of all the hedges in the garden. All of them. So if you look at that plant, could it be? It could be the one I'm looking at, could be this one, right? So, I'm just going to change the wording to say potentially or which appear to be. This is one thing I've noticed from writing journalism. You tell the truth. And writing research, you tell the truth, which means you have to, it's a dangerous thing if you're a storyteller to become a researcher. So you have to tell the truth, and the truth is told via qualification. And qualification happens in words. And so you have to be a bit of a lawyer. So I have to change this to appears to be. Because I'm giving my argument, but I'm demonstrating that, or appears to me to be. So I own it. And so, but what you can see straight away is that, that structure is uniform. We can see how all of those hedges in 1982 are roughly the same. The interiors of the spaces created by the planting plan are different. And I can tell you from the fact that I've crawled in there, I must have, get back there in a second. This is his diagram. Hang on a second. Why did I put those diagrams later? I don't know, there's a diagram missing here. Oh, there. I didn't focus on these diagrams, I focused on these. No, but first of all, I have to tell a story. Hang on, since I'm a storyteller. So when I arrived in this garden, first, I knew about it, and I knew about it really because of these structures, and mostly because of where's the picture? That picture. And this woman, Anne Whiston Spurn, used it as a thing to say that Sven Ingvar Andersson, who's the old man I was on a few pages back, that he used to say to demonstrate an argument about plants, and again, you always make your arguments built on the shoulders of others. He used to say that my plants, these are my chickens, and this is my hen yard. And he had kids, so this is his idea of the hen yard. And so he's planted the hen yard, and they're hawthorns. Now, the species, and this is crucial, the species that hedge is made of, and the species that these are made of, are the same species. The only thing that's changed about and different around them is how they've been maintained to give a certain form. And so he used to say that these are his chickens in the hen yard, and that he used to say these hens are going to be hens for as long as I can get on my ladder to prune them. But once I can no longer get on my ladder to prune them, therefore the hen yard will turn into a hawthorn grove. And for me, this was an interesting thing because it demonstrated how without maintenance practice, the forms would not stay the same. And that's an interesting thing because it tells you, in a way, the garden is a registration of his aging process. What you do in the garden, when you see an old garden from an old gardener, it changes often because of the fact that they're losing their ability to stay on top of the garden. And the garden changes into something else. There's a lot of what this book is about. And so, in a way, I went there thinking, wow, I can't wait to see how his hens have turned into a hawthorn grove. And instead, what I discovered is this. They're still hens. And so that told me that in actual fact, obviously, they've still been pruned because they're a thing. The people who go to that garden go to see the hens. We've got to keep pruning the hens, man, because if it turns into a hawthorn grove, who's going to want to visit it? Everyone who goes there, they want to see the hens, man. That's the thing, right? So there's an interesting thing there because it didn't fit with my kind of story. And so what I really was looking at was this idea of that when I did visit it, what I saw instead was vegetation like this. And so if you consider that the previous image I saw showed these vegetated walls as being like this, that when we get to the garden and it's like this, we can see that there's been a lot of transformation going on because of maintenance techniques. And so as I approach the garden from the wrong direction, and so this is where I'm referring back to people like Christophe Giraud and Sebastian Marot about ideas about visiting sites and the landing experience and being attuned to it. What I was discovered straight away is that there's a whole other story to this garden that people had not told me, that had nothing to do with them. And so I basically started to look through and to find out what was happening in that place and happened over time. Now, I now have archival photographs that I've discovered in the last 6 months that I didn't ever had before. So when I visited, I was trying to crawl inside these hedges which are full of weeds and do measurements and what's going on here, you know, and finding out how it worked. And so I unpack my process of visiting and as a process of logic. And I look at how you move through the garden to see different sorts of things, and how those hedges over time had all turned into totally different things. And so all of those were the same plants in 1982 because all of the edges of the whole garden had the same effect a long time. And so on the one hand, you could say, well, maintenance practices failed, but that for me is not about maintenance practices. That's about competition. That's about the fact that there's limited light making its way through. The plants are going up to compete for light, but at a certain point, he let the plants go. He let some of the plants go and decided, I'm not going to prune them. I'm just going to see what happens. And so that act starts to play out across the garden in different sorts of ways. And so here you can see that's what the space used to look like. That's what the space now looks like, you know. And so one of the interesting spaces, and that's the edge of this space, which is that now we're seeing a very different thing that can only be talked about through maintenance. And so we can see that pruning is still happening over this side and this side, but ultimately he allowed his hawthorns here to keep going up to become small trees. And that's created a situation where you can now see between that compartment and that compartment. This creates a situation where the type of spatial enclosure is totally different to what it was planted with. And so ultimately in this chapter, what I'm arguing is that those plant locations at 500 centres are the same as those plant locations. I measured them. So the same plants are still there. What changed? Maintenance changed. What changed out of that? Spatial definition, radically. Did the planting plan change? And the answer is no, the planting plan stayed exactly the same. So that's the current of those compartments I visited. That's the current planting plan. This line type here shows where plants have been hedged and the hedge has been maintained. This shows where individual plants have been left. This shows where there is now a penetration through the hedges. But at the same time, you can see how with the same locations, the spatial envelope has completely changed. And that's just important to argue. Sorry guys, the planting plan is not going to do everything for you here. It's not going to give you the answer to the spatial complexity you can get. And so the rest of the chapter, I really focus on how emergent things in the design of the garden to do with views, to do with spaces, how all of those things were customized around eye-level experience that emerged from the planting plan over time. And so what I ultimately look at is this really interesting thing where here's an example of one particular hedge that I'm interested in. And this is an example of where 3 plant forms are on the same plant and they're only different because of maintenance. And so here, that same hawthorn has been pruned to produce a hedge. So in other words, it's constantly clipped to produce a hedge, working with apical dominance. On this side over here, it's creating a small shrub or a small tree to another space. Whereas when it grows tall, it's providing a canopy to the garden. 1 plant, 3 different formal configurations. All of them arising through maintenance. And that's a really interesting thing for a material, to be able to have that much latent difference within it. And so, and that's an example of, that's one of those pieces. That's one of the plants I'm talking about. And you can see how that thing has been pruned in certain sorts of ways to maintain those kinds of things. Yeah. Eugenia, yeah.
The back where you walk around is like perfectly manicured.
Yeah.
And the top they just let go. So you've got like these massive units that actually create the area on the other side where the T-Log is.
Yeah.
Completely close that off.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting to have that shape where it's like completely manicured on one side and the top it just let go into massive trees.
And I think that's a really interesting approach, that those things are all latent in the same plant. And that ties back to Anderson's idea that when I stop being able to cut the chickens will turn into a hawthorn grove. And he would say both of those are implicit in the DNA of that plant. And so this is why I end up looking at this guy Jacques Menon as well for his writing about the relationship between the interior of the organism and the external environment around ideas about teleology and about whether there's a direction in nature, which I'll talk about later. And so that's the first section. I'll go faster through this section because I have to. But the second section, called gardening design, isn't that a beautiful thing that Mike developed there, eh? So what that's supposed to be is talk about this dynamic between the laboratory and the kind of the canvas. That's what that dynamic is about. So in this case study, what I look at is the garden of the Sitio Roberto Burle Marx. And the Sitio Roberto Burle Marx is Burle Marx's own garden. And so, a lot of the time I am sniping at certain writers and people in this book. And one of the things that I'm arguing about is the unnecessary polarization of art and science and aesthetics and science. And I think it's unnecessary and disingenuous, because every technical discipline is always creative and it's always pragmatic. And so it's disingenuous. And a lot of the time, landscape urbanism has led to this real boom of process-based things where the arguments are sounding very scientific, but I argue that there's a kind of latent aesthetic in there which is not really talked about. And for me, latent aesthetics are fine, but in a way I'm more interested in opening them up for discourse. And so with this, I found this piece of writing by this guy called Roberio Diaz, and Roberio Diaz was the professor of landscape architecture at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And if you want to go to a place and see what can happen in a state that's in a pretty weird space, that's an interesting university. It's a whole island, modernist island made in a kind of river in Rio, and they built so much on it that they can't keep up with it, and so the whole buildings and everything are falling down. He has to bring his own Wi-Fi router. It's like the whole place is and he worked for Burle Marx, and he was extremely generous with me, and I got to visit the garden with him and talk to him for a lot. And he wrote about this idea that the CTO was a landscape laboratory, and so it's a really important idea here. And I had a really interesting thing, which as a researcher I will tell you about. And Roberio, if you ever listen to this, please listen to this account. So Roberio is the authority, I would say, the utmost authority on the CTO Burle Marx, because he was the director. CTO Burle Marx was Burle Marx's own nursery. It's now part of the Patrimony, as it's known, or the sort of national estate of Brazil. And so it's a really important place. If you ever get to Brazil and ever get to Rio, which is a place I totally recommend you should go to, then definitely go to see this place. It's incredible. Anyway, what's interesting is that Roberio worked for Burle Marx, and as Burle Marx was getting old, Burle Marx and Roberio were talking, and Burle Marx used to have these wonderful Sunday afternoon lunches where people from all over the world and artists and people would come and they would have food and wine and talk about art and like awesome. And so I would have loved to have been there. But one of the things that's interesting about it is also that suddenly Bill Marx thought, well, what am I going to do with this place? You know, it's my main place where I test things out and work things out. And so Ribeiro said, well, maybe you need to think about donating it to the government, you know. And so they organised that. He was allowed to stay there until his death. They agreed to a certain sort of mission for it. Now, the problem came when Ribeiro became the director, where basically he took Bill Marx on his word when Bill Marx said, this is my learning and testing space. And so he said, this is a dynamic place. It's not a museum to Bill Marx, because there's lots of projects you could visit of Bill Marx's. So this is not a museum. This is Bill Marx's working space. And so it's also, he called his landscape laboratory. And the problem was, of course, that the Patrimony kind of wanted to leave it how it was. And so they wanted to sort of return it to what Bill Marx had it. But he said, no, it's actually a space of learning and testing. And so to do it right, we have to keep learning and testing. And so he then also started working and trying to work with some of the tests that Bill Marx was using on the site. And ultimately, the Patrimony and the gardeners, they had some disagreements with him on this interpretation, because ultimately this is about historic places. How do you have a garden as a historic place when it's subject to change? You know, what are you trying to restore it to? How do you restore a testing place back to a condition when then testing is what it's all about? And so I thought this was an interesting place to talk about the relationship between science and ideas about the laboratory and the relationship between science and art. Now, for my book, it's important because I'm reconciling in this model of the veridic the idea about talk about biology, biological effects, ecology. Now, at the moment, if you talk about those things, you end up in landscape ecology, you end up in this space that's very scientific and technical. Or you end up in this fluffy realm of art and design, it's not functional, whatever. How do you bring those two together? So reconciling, this is the chapter I decided to do it. So anyway, I used a lot of what he was talking about and argued with it. Now, that's a normal thing you do. You argue with people in a writing. Now, he accuses me of doing something that's called, he says I made him a straw man. Now, that's an expression you may or may not have heard of, but it's basically building something up to take it down. It's a rhetorical device. We do it a lot. We kind of make a caricature of something to build it down. I mean, it's something that happens a lot, you know, in South Africa, where caricatures are made all over the place about certain things. And a lot of the time, like the classic one, you know, what was last weekend, right? This thing about in the football about this guy, they're saying was an equity hire, right? And he was like, fuck you, I'm a footballer. I played my football fair and square, you know. And so this is this sort of idea about a caricature and those kind of things. And so anyway, so he got very angry with me because he said, you're actually just arguing with me about nothing. Why are you arguing with me? And so I was arguing with him to build this case about bringing these two things together, Ribeiro. Oh, most respect for you, man. So anyway, so Bill Marx, we know who Bill Marx is. You know, this is the kind of the garden now. It's actually quite a large site, and Ribeiro. One of the things, you know, this is where the nursery is. You can see how large it is, the nursery, and one of the things that Bill Marx had as part of his laboratory, he had this two-stage process, which is a really simple process, which is to have and to get and to use were his two stages of his process. So he used to do these amazing botanical trips where Bill Marx used to go out to all over Brazil and collect plants. And he used to go for like a month on end. He used to take students with him, and they used to basically go out into the Amazon and places and collect. And so, you know, there was one guy who's and also a friend of mine who I met through this process, Oscar Brazan, who was actually with Bill Marx on one of these trips, who was, you know, he was a spotter. And so he would basically be able to look in the distance in a forest and see an epiphyte. and then the truck would stop, and then they'd bolt out into the forest, and they'd grab a few of these epiphytes and chuck them in the back, etc., and bring them back. And once they brought them back, they went into a process of what's known as, acclimation. And acclimation is really, trying to acclimatize a plant to a location. So obviously you move it from its natural zone and get it to here. And so this first stage of to get is to put it in the nursery and to stabilize it and to start multiplying it. Basically, once you've got it, grow more of it and stabilize a population in the nursery. And so that was the sort of the first thing that he used to do. And if I go to that space, these are the that's inside the greenhouse. You'd love it. It would, it's like, particularly since I think you like this family, right?
Yeah.
And so, this is where that's an amazing place. And so to use was then to say he'll start to take a population of it out into the landscape of the garden, and he would put it in 5 or 6 different places. Put it in full sun, put it where it's dry, put it in partial shade where it's damp, put it in 20 different places in the garden and see how it performed, see what happened. And so these were his tests. And so it's a fascinating kind of process. And the garden has these, this is just a walk through the garden, and has all of these tests located in it. And so this is where you go into this interesting hypothetical ground where it's a garden of tests and it's also a garden of techniques. And so I argue in this thing something which is probably not fair, and that was that Diaz is polarizing the aesthetic from the scientific. So he's using this model of the laboratory, and thereby he's buying into this sort of what I call a scientism, which is that he's focusing on that at the expense of the fact that Burle Marx was always making aesthetic calls at the same time, because he would have ultimately made a call to collect the plant on the basis of aesthetics. Once it got there, he may have done something else, but he would always anticipate it on the basis of an aesthetic use of the plant later. And so the aesthetics is not detached from this exercise. And so what I look at, and this is an example, this is actually where Ribeiro created a path to navigate the landscape. And what I really love about this is that's basically like one mold, or a few versions of the one mold. And the way you would work on it, if you can imagine, is you would dig a hole, you would get the concrete mold, you would pour the concrete into it, you would flatten it off, you would take the mold off, you would dig another hole, you would put the mold on top. You can turn it round the other direction if you want to make it turn the other way. Such a nice way to do a set of steps, And so this was an example where what Ribeiro did was he navigated his way around the garden. Now, when we see this, what we're seeing is, in a way, a display of Burle Marx planting design techniques. And one of his techniques was a very simple one, which was the public never sees one plant. You can only see a plant if you put in hundreds of them. And so he always worked with masses generally. And this is something that's come through but is very unpopular now. For example, since Piet Oudolf and that Dutch wave school, a lot of the planting is now around working with mixed perennials. And so anyway, this is a demonstration of probably something like a museum. This is a demonstration of people coming to see Burle Marx as Burle Marx planting, which is also, he had other techniques, things like he called about correlated and uncorrelated textures, something he also talked about, which is where there might be a variance in colour but a similarity in plant form and things like that. So he was very interested in keeping something that's similar and modulating it in some way. So we find, for instance, a whole lot of use of strappy-leafed plants, but different species of them. So he would call that a kind of correlated texture in his planting. Anyway, so this, as you move down through the garden, you go back to this lake, which you see at the bottom, which is just an incredible kind of thing, and you view that lake from this path, and then you appear at this place. And now what's interesting about this is that when Burle Marx put this together, this planting design configuration, he did it basically just via arranging it on site, which I'll get back to. Anyway, so I talk about the idea of the planting as laboratory, and I talk about examples where something has been gotten and then something has been used. And so I try to find examples where multiple things have come from one location and ended up in another location. And I really counterpoint this idea of the studio and the laboratory. And I really make the case that the artist studio and the studio that we would generally use is a place of testing as much as the laboratory is a place of testing. And the laboratory is also a place of creativity. So I kind of try to break down that model, which I was finding from Dias to be overly weighted towards the kind of empirical and the botanic. Whereas in actual fact, as any botanist would tell you, he was not a botanist, even though he had the biggest collection of Ariaceae in the world. And so that's just a way of trying to find a sort of way of those two languages coming together. And so also I talk, and to do that, I also talk about some of these things I call the aesthetic qualities of growth. And this is really a section where I am trying to look at the language, conventional language of planting design, and come up with a different take on it. So the conventional language of planting design is always basically colour, texture, form, seasonality, sometimes smell, etc. So it's a very limited idea. And it's got that problem, which I always find when you try to teach design via principles, where you try to give it's like the same thing I used previously about trying to, I don't know if I used this example previously, but describing LSD to someone via actually testing their blood pressure. You're never going to get to what the effects of that drug is like. And studio is like that, right? You try, and that's what the Introduction to Spatial Design project was about. There's no point drawing a diagram called this is a design process. The only way to do it is to, put somebody on the cliff of design and push them off. It's the only way you learn design, right? We know this. So this is where what I'm really talking about is that I think that this is a very misunderstood idea about design as this model of this painterly model. I refuse to accept it as being a comprehensive planning design model. And so what instead I do is, and we're going to be a little bit late, I'm sorry about that today, but in the middle of my own first lecture on my book, so can't stop, right? And so, what I do instead is I try to bring together those languages and to talk about how whenever we talk about those things, we're always talking about science as well. And the way I use it is to talk about what's known as plant functional type. And plant functional type is an interesting thing. I don't know whether or not you've ever had it talk to you. Did you guys ever talk to you in plants and design? Plant functional type, you come across it? So it's interesting because if you take an evolutionary argument, everything, when you see a plant, you're seeing an evolutionary success. So technically everything that was, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jess, but if you are in a situation where you see a living plant, either every genetic property it's got has either been helpful or not been terminal. Is that reasonable?
Or not been expressed.
Or not been expressed. That's right. Or not been expressed. And so therefore, when you're looking at a plant form, when you're looking at something called texture, you're actually looking at a adaptation. And so therefore, if you're looking at it as an adaptation, if you're always looking at it in relationship to its regulating environment in some way, because you're always seeing a dynamic between an environment and a plant characteristic. And so what I do in this section is I really look into plant morphology in relationship to the types of plants that he really liked using in his correlated volumes. This is an idea of how in each chapter I try to dig into one particular area quite deep. In the Miller Garden, it's the maintenance history. In Courances, it's the history of the site, changes of maintenance practices, etc. And so, here it says the clearest cases of the effective function on the form of plants are in morphological adaptation to environmental conditions. So you're always looking at an evolutionary, you're always looking at an environment whenever you're looking at a shape of a plant in some sense. So, in this process, patterns and processes are mutually causal with changes in ecosystem processes causing changes in pattern and modifications in ecosystem pattern changing processes. And so what that's saying, the key thing to note is here, pattern and process. So in other words, form and process are together. Formation, again, not separated. And so going through here, what we're looking at is ultimately, and what I'm talking about ultimately, are the family Araceae, which of course is the family of the philodendron, not to be confused with Ericaceae, which is the family of the palm. And so what I really do is I talk about aroids a lot, and because I also love aroids because I spent years in the tropics, and I particularly talk about this thing which is known as the high specific leaf area, or SLA, which is influential on the physiology of relative growth rate, which is to say, plants are always, I've said this to you, plants are pumps, and because plants are pumps, they're also out of control pumps. They're a bit like us. Every regulating system needs to be kept in some level of homeostasis to be able to succeed. Now, we're mobile, so we can move, do things that's one of the reasons why we've succeeded, is that we can move ourselves into another location when it's too hot. We can go and grab a drink of water. Plant can't do that. So they're highly regulating in their environment. So leaf shape is always about evapotranspiration, or about transpiration. And so it's always about modulating and keeping a balance between transpiration and available water. So therefore, leaf shape and leaf size is also always about that. And so when we're talking about aroids, we're actually talking about plants that are adapted to shade by having a large leaf area, and that's generally green. But we're also talking about another habit that rainforest plants have, which is around dormancy. So rainforest plants are also able to be dormant very easily. It's that thing of, you'll see a tree in the rainforest that's about 1.5 meters high. It could be 60 years old, and it's just waiting till there's a hole in the canopy, and the next thing, it's straight up in the canopy. Now, similarly, the aroids, a lot of them are climbers and ramblers. They can take a lot of time to get up there. A lot of them are colonists, so they're also about working in those gaps. And so they have this dynamic where they're actually quite hardy, and this is something we often find about some rainforest species. We think that they're desperate for water, but they're actually very hardy a lot of the time. And so this is where the leaf shape is about regulating growth rate. And so I use that as a way of talking about how the philodendrons, how the shape of the leaves that Burl Marx liked was particularly around certain adaptations to their environment. And so in a way, we're always talking about those adaptations. And I go through, this is a kind of a plant scene, and I go through all these different varieties of Araceae that he would have in that planting environment. I also talk about anthocyanins, which are basically leaf colour. And so anthocyanins are where a plant has a red colour of a leaf, and it's also a response to reduce evapotranspiration. Chlorophyll photosynthesizes a lot, and otherwise the reduction of chlorophyll is a way of controlling that. Okay, we're just going to be about 15, 20 minutes. All right?
No, we just had a conversation about that yesterday.
Okay. Are we in agreement? Okay. And so in a way, this is this is where, Burl Marx would say, you must know the language of nature. If you don't know the language, you cannot create a poem. And so this is where the language of nature is this science. You can't put it in a box and call it science and then think that you're doing art. Because to do the art, you have to do the science. When it comes to plants, if the plant won't grow, the art's not going to work. I mean, it's a simple, straightforward thing. So, in other words, this polarization between aesthetics and science is bullshit, man. And so, this is it's a waste of time. Give it up. And so, the final 2 chapters are all about. So, if you can think, this chapter here was all about him doing stuff in real time that affected how he designed things. So we're moving into a thing where everything's now about real time. And so in the last 2 chapters, what I'm really looking at now is gardening-led design approaches. And so I'm entirely talking about that. And this first one is a garden. Guess where it is? It's in Scotland. And it's a guy called Geoffrey Dutton. And Geoffrey Dutton, who is that dude there, he's a really interesting guy. He had this garden. He did this book, and I've always got a story in how I find out about this. And so the story is that I was procrastinating, and I went to a bookshop and I found this book called Every Branch to the Sky, or A Branch to the Sky, and I thought, that's an interesting book, and I bought it. And so, and also that was called The Practices and Principles of Marginal Gardening, and I thought that's a really interesting idea. And so what he talks about when he talks about marginal gardening is I'll get to that in a second, but Dutton's interesting because he actually he's what you'd call a kind of polymath, where his job is that he's a biochemist, essentially. And so let's go through and just, basically what his garden, okay, let's go back. So this is what his job was, is that his steroid metabolism is what he's working on in an important metabolic modification of endogenous and exogenous compounds. Now this is important. Endogenous means inside, exogenous means outside. So it goes back again to our discussions around genetics and this idea about the relationship between the internal dynamic of the system and the external relationship to it. And his books are still utilized today. But he was a really interesting guy because he was also into adventure activities. And so one of the things was that he was an underwater photographer. And so he was really used to do all of these amazing photographs of dealing with the underwater environment of these lakes in Scotland as forests. And so he used to try to photograph the underwater as forests. At the same time, he was also a mountaineer, and he had this garden called Drumshardain. And so the Drumshardains, which was the garden that was described in the book that I found that day, is interesting. It's on a hill, and it's probably useful to this is the kind of landscape you get to get up to it. So it's like crazy romantic Scottish highlands. Which I always look at and I think that's actually a site of environmental degradation. Like, that's covered in gorse. It's like, it's so beautifully destroyed. And so this is the garden. And this diagram, which I'm going to actually have to tell him to flip around, describes the way that the garden worked. And so the reason he called it a marginal garden was that it was on the margin. So it's technically a piece of land that didn't exist. And so here was this burn, or this creek as it's known, and it was on the edge of a piece of farmer's land. And so what he said to the farmer was, can I buy that piece of land and the embankments around it? And the farmer said, well, we don't use those embankments for anything. And so, sure, I'll just make some money for nothing here. And so I'll buy this. So the first idea of marginal is, it's marginal, the site didn't even exist. It's on the margin of another land use. Now, the second idea of marginal for him was that the margin is actually the margin is a space where there is environmental change. So it's also a space between indigenous vegetation and disturbed landscape. It's also the margin between where the snow at the top of that hill there is kind of semi-permanent snow, and at the base are trees. So it's on the margin between climatic zones. And for him, the most important thing is he only had marginal time to look after it. And so this is where he came up with this idea about marginal gardening. And he ultimately defined marginal gardening as the minimum you can do to have the maximum effect, because he had only a certain amount of time. So it's like Louis Leroy, we talked about last week, and his brick piling. And so he had these 4 routes or 5 routes that he would walk up and down the site all the time, doing certain things. And essentially what he was doing, and This is his cabin where he lived, and this is a kind of tour of the site, is that, he lived in this cabin, or more particularly, he worked in Dundee at the university, and his wife and kids lived in this cabin. He came home on weekends. And then, he had this bridge across the site, and what he was really doing was he was gardening these enclosures. So he was just like they were just naturally occurring, and he might cut one tree out, he might introduce a plant over here, and he might just do a little bit, and that's what he was doing. So essentially, he was marginally changing the environment, where the margin also was a bit about if you change it too much, you're going to have to weed later. So he's in this little fine calibrated marginal approach. But at the same time, he had, so that, for example, he might do, that's as much landscaping as he would do. He would put like a couple of rocks in. But the rest of everything he did was all around, other techniques. And so, and he also had a kind of military methodology. And so, for example, all the way through, he had these little base camps where he would have these little hutches where he could, when it started to rain, he could jump inside the hutch where there'd be some tools, there'd be some fertilizer, pair of secateurs, and they'd just wait out the rain and read a book, and then when the rain stopped, come back out again and keep working. And, a lot of the time ferrying something from hutch 1 to hutch 2 and working his way up the hill. Interestingly, he regarded his research and the work he was doing in the landscape in the same terms, because he said both of them are about the regulation of ecologies. For his research is the regulation between the environment and the organism, and that's his actual chemistry he was doing, and his gardening was about the regulation of these spaces in relationship to the environment. And so, over time, this is an example. These are examples of what sort of, this is ultimately the kind of changes that have happened to the spaces over time, because obviously now he's no longer there. And so part of the story of this is also the story about the other side of working in this gardening way, which is as soon as you stop, the environment keeps going. So how you maintain and work over time with it is a sort of story. And so I'm visiting with his kids now, and it's about what the kids bring to their story of this place. And so their story of this place is a totally different story to his story of this place. Their story is about their dad and about what they remember their dad doing. One of them likes using a chainsaw, one of them likes using a weed eater. So both of their things work around that. Now, one of the things I'm arguing for is that this is about site specificity, and one of the cases I make in the book is to work with the Viridic. One has to work with site specificity, non-representational, direct engagement with sites, and that in actual fact, site is what it's all about. And so the Viridic is always about site. And so when we move on here, I think that, it's interesting that his main thing and his main medium, in actual fact, interestingly, was really poetry. And so through the book, I talk a lot about representation, drawings, photographs, and I consciously talk about it because I'm working with this idea about the present and the past and the future. When I'm working with this idea of working in real time, that you do something in real time, that it has an effect, and as it has an effect, something emerges. So the tree's shape now is the registration of the effect previously. That's called prochronism. It's where a shell shows, when you see a shell and it has those marks on it from the spiral, where each mark is actually like an example of where the shell grew, the tree rings, they're prochronisms. They're marks that arise from the growth process. So the dynamic between present, future, and past is all that gardening's about. And so I also, in this chapter, I talk about the idea of poetry as a representational mechanism. Now, ironically, this polymath Dutton was also a poet. And he also published a book of poetry about his garden. And so I talk about the relationship between poetry and science, and I look at, some of his poetry, and so, and if we look at his, if we look at it, I'll actually read it. I'll read it. Why, just to choose a corner of the wilderness is to enclose it with intent is to create gardener, a life spent cropping the rubble, a desire to regulate what goes by, catch a scent, ensure some branch against the sky, is to incur from the first day what creation cost, the haste, to cut and tear, rake things over. At the least we need to look about, decide what wild flower that may have led you there is now a weed. To this he appended, no small responsibility, a garden, however marginal. So what he's alluding to is a design process. That's a design process. It's about reactivity. It's about the idea that wilderness is about enclosure. It's about the idea that the garden and the gardener are created at the same time. It's about the idea of regulation. As a scientist, his whole scientific thing is about regulation, you know? And so it's also about this idea at the end that what once was a wildflower is now a weed. So it's also recognizing the role of interpretation of nature. And so you know, you can see it's quite a important sort of thing. And so one thing he also talked about a lot, which we'll look about, and this is my favorite of his poems. I think it's a really amazing one. It is only the simple sunlight on a fence post out of snow, and I come to set it upright at the cost of a single blow. Then I leave them to the sunlight, one straight post, trodden snow. And what I like about that is that it gets, again, this regulation idea, which is that he's doing his route up and down, he's checking, he's fixing, and what he's leaving behind is both this artifact changed and then a totally ephemeral thing, a footstep that's about to disappear in snow. And so what I look at in this whole chapter, which I won't go into depth, is about seasonality. And I look at what Dutton says needs to be done at different times of the year. And if we go back to my original thing about what growth is, we're talking about bud location, potential of the bud, and timing. And so this is where I get the idea that unless we work in the real time, we don't understand the role that seasonality has. Now in South Africa, that obviously means about things like watering and a whole range of things. But in the Northern Hemisphere, obviously it is quite different in those parts. And so, for example, for him, winter is the time for pruning because you can see the form of the tree. You know, winter is the time of architecture for him. So each time he has, and I look at each season and look at what activities and maintenance practices he does to work with these sorts of things, you know. You know, so what he's really talking about a lot of the time, you know, again, I draw analogies between his other practice. And so he says, you know, as a molecular biologist and a proponent of enzyme ecology, you know, the molecular photochemical system that the plant possesses, built, stocked, and tuned to give maximum efficiency to whatever light its position exposes itself to. So he's working with the photosynthetic when he's designing. He's thinking about how the light works, where it's coming, what it's going to do. If he opens up a hole, what's going to come up in that hole. He's specifically designing a place for emergence to occur. You know, it's a similar sort of language, you know. And so all the way through, I find different things that he does at different times, you know. And so, for example, in summer, you know, he's working with what he talks about are the horizontals and verticals, and he's mowing. Summer is his mowing practice. And he works with this idea about kicking the mower up on the side to create these graduated edges between the sort of surface and these things. And he's working with horizontals and verticals. You know, he's creating these kinds of spaces. And each time he has an inflection about what each offers. And so what I'm arguing really in that chapter is this, that missing seasonality is a major absence in design practice. And you can say you must do this in this season, but are you as a designer working with that process in what you're doing? And so it's to say that we have to use a real-time process to deal with seasonality. And so the final chapter, well, not the final chapter, but the penultimate chapter, I promise you'll be out here in 15 minutes, okay? Promise. So this chapter called Wait and See is about this place called Insel Hombruch, another place I would totally recommend you go to if you have a chance. It's, you know, luckily there are crazy people around the place with money, right? If there weren't crazy people with money, we wouldn't have Babylon's Torah, and we wouldn't have all these places. Now, they may be vain, they may have been making them for themselves, they may be terrible outcomes of capitalism. But to some extent, if there weren't these kind of crazies, we'd never have these kind of gardens to visit. But this is about a guy who he designed this place called the Hombroich, Insel Hombroich, as a collaboration between nature and culture is what he kind of called it. And so in this chapter, what I'm looking at is this amazing garden that I really liked, and I'm looking at it because of the fact that the designers of it and the people who work on it, they really have run the entire thing via real-time practices. So there's no representational aspect. The only plans that were drawn for authorities, and everything else was done on site. And it's a big landscape. And so it's based around this old English garden that's sitting in this area that's known as the Niederrhein, which is really where the Rhine is sort of flowing out into these. As we start to move towards the Netherlands, we're moving into these wetland landscapes, saturated soils, big wetlands. And so this was an English garden in amongst this landscape where next to the English garden is an old rocket station, a kind of Cold War rocket station that was there. And what the guys who designed it did was that because they forced them to, this guy Bernhard Korte had to basically try to recreate the Niederrhein landscape. And so in this landscape, this architect called Heerijk designed all of these with artist actually designed all of these buildings, these outdoor pavilion art galleries in the landscape, and none of them had artists' things on them. So there was a curatorial intention to each of them, but none of them do they say this artwork is by this person or it's by that person. Each of them has their own internalized dynamic inside it. Each of them is about a certain sort of collection. And so throughout the landscape, there are a range of these different spaces. Like, for example, these are all Khmer heads that look out onto a landscape. They have this weird, I don't know whether it's a performance, but it seems like it, but they have this weird cafeteria when you pay to get in. They provide your lunch, and the food is like really weird. I don't know whether that's just German food, and I don't know it, but it was really weird. And so and then they do, there's some cute things like, they have these trees here that they cut so you sit underneath them. And so I talk in this chapter about 3 people. And this really closes if you remember in my first chapter, I talked about the idea of the tree surgeon, the idea of the smart casual landscape architect. I talked about these sort of practical roles. In this chapter, I come back to land with all of that. And I have these 3 people, and I talk about the designer, the manager, and the gardener. And I look at how they relate to each other. And so, this is Bernhard Korte. He's the first person, and he's the guy who designed, and this is just him and I meeting in the Botanic Gardens at Neuss, which is the town where this is. And Bernhard Korte and I, he was very generous. In fact, all these guys are very generous with me. And he and I talked about how he got onto this project. Now, interestingly, he had an antique store in Dusseldorf. He met this guy, Muller, who owned and set up the garden. And because Korte had studied horticulture and done his PhD in horticulture, ironically in the economics of nursery management, and now ran an antique store, people had just started to ask him to do gardens. And because he was kind of into Art Deco, and he was into aesthetics, and he was an aesthete, he started designing gardens. And he became a very prominent garden designer who largely did not draw, who largely worked on site with people doing things. And so, Korte was a really interesting kind of guy. And what he talks about, it's interesting, is that for instance, he won't talk about, the ecological, for example, which again he thinks this is a sort of a polarization. He always talks about aesthetics as environment and organism and aesthetics at the same time. So, he talks about, this idea of it's a bit like this guy, like Ferrari. And so, he talks about beings in the garden all the time, the way the different beings. And so for instance, and he refuses to talk about ecology as such. And so when I talk about Udolf, he knows Udolf, and he says, no, Udolf is not interested in ecology. Udolf is interested primarily in aesthetics. Now, everybody who talks about Udolf, and indeed even how Udolf is talked about generally, is about ecology in relationship to the plant species. And he says, well, it's easier to talk about ecology than to talk about aesthetics, And so we had this really interesting conversation. And, there's some really interesting stories. Like, for instance, one of the things that happens in this, what he basically decided was to treat the Niederrhein as a cultural landscape, not as a natural landscape. And so that means that these are pollarded willow trees, I think. Yes, they're pollarded willow trees. And those trees he collected from the Niederrhein region, but in Belgium. And he describes having to, basically found a farmer who was dozing about 200 of these trees on a property, and he drove up to get them and brought them back. And when he brought them back across the border in Germany, they said, "What's this?" And because it was winter, he just said, "Oh, it's firewood." And he got them into Germany by saying that they were firewood. And you'll see here how, on the one hand, they replicate the Niederrhein environment in his garden as a kind of a natural environment. For him, it was always much richer. And so, for example, this thing here, which is actually utilising Fraxinus, what they've basically done is the Fraxinus, a weeping Fraxinus, they've cut the underside of them to create these shelters, and you can basically crawl inside and sit under the tree on seats. And so this is, again, a cultural practice. And so when they tried to make Niederrhein ecological, he just didn't say to them, he always treated it as cultural, because he also treated the organisms as cultural, as part of beings in that landscape. Now, obviously Korte had ideas about things, but the project flowered under other people. And this is one of the things you have to accept. As a designer, you're never going to get to see the project forever. Eventually, you'll either fall out, lose interest, you'll get given up on. And so one of the sad things about being a landscape architect is often you don't get to be present for the later times when it flowers, but you'll often want to try to claim responsibility for that as being your vision, having done so myself. And so this is where it's interesting then to talk to Burkhard Damm, who is the manager, about the project, because Burkhard works in an office. He's a much cooler younger guy, not younger really, my age, and he also studied at Leibniz University. But interestingly, when he got to the site, he was a family friend of the architect Hierich, and a lot of the time he found his sense of the garden is much more ecological. And the reason it's much more ecological is he's in the business of management. And so whereas Korte was talking about people like Udolf in terms of aesthetics and talking about ecology in terms of aesthetics, for Burkhard and for the next person we're going to talk about, ecology is super important because they have to deal day to day with the effects of ecology, growth. So when you've got square meters and staff allocated, you have to be economical. You have to think about how much time something's going to cost. And so when I talked, one of the key things, how much I've talked about pruning in this book already. And so when I talked about, how it was interesting how Korte was using these plantings and all of these kind of things like this, he said to me, and on the basis of this cultural view of nature, he said, well, that's all very well, but I have to ensure I have 100 plus volunteers twice a year to maintain these, because I don't have the staff to maintain this effect. And so his effect that he put in all those times that was about maintenance is a day-to-day disaster for me. So this is me closing the cycle of my own argument. It's a downside of my own argument, essentially. And so instead, he's interested in this thing from the Dutch wave, which we'll talk about regulation. And so also, he talks about, Dan, when he's, I'm interested in the thinking process of working from a manager at a big scale down to a site scale. How do you think about it? And in a way, what he talks about is this idea of what he really called I'll go back and say, one of the things that happened first off for Burckhardt is when he started about 3 years after Korte had left, and what he had was a site covered with 8-foot high nettles, like top to bottom, because what Korte had created was disturbance. And what happens with disturbance is massive regrowth. And so what came and looked great initially as a aesthetic, as a kind of a thing around recreating the Niederrhein, became a kind of a disaster area of constant cutting. And so he's had to use cutting for all those years to try to selectively use the cutting to reduce the population of nettles in the lawn, to be able to reduce the amount of time he cuts the lawn. But initially, because there was all of this water coming in that also had pig manure in it, there was so much nutrient load on that soil that it took them 4 years, 5 years of mowing to get the nutrient, harvest the nutrient and get it out of the soil, effectively using phytoremediation to allow it to grow. And so what he talks about, though, when I'm trying to think about how to go between manager and site, what he talks about is this idea of that there is he talks about this idea of frames, which is that for each area, it has for him a frame. No problem. If anyone needs to bail. But I'll honestly only be 10 minutes. But the landscape students can't bail because they're mine. But and so this is where he talks about this idea of frame. So whereas we might think about design, he thinks about frame in terms of, good on you, mate. I see an architecture student still here. That's fine. So when he talks about frame, he's talking about a piece of landscape, in a way, an epitome in his head. He's got a mental, what Corner would have called an eidetic idea in his head about what that landscape is. And when he manages it in relation to that frame. And so, for example, for the old island, where the English garden is, the frame for him is to some extent weirdly the tropical. But what he means by that is leaves. It's all about deep shade and leaves. For other areas, it's about the meadow and it's got certain things. So with that definition in his head, he then makes management decisions on the basis of how things do or don't fit into that mental image on a site. So he hasn't as such got a design, he's got a type of design judgment that he brings to how he manages a place that's still aesthetic. And then he has what he calls the leash, which is that he'll let the leash out and pull it in. He's trying to minimize, to know how much you can let the leash out before the overall sense of that landscape changes into something else. Because he's trying to do as little as possible to keep it with that same frame. Does that make sense? So how can you do as little as possible to keep it actually how it still fits within that frame? So he's maintaining, using design judgment around economic things. Now, the final part, which is interesting, is this guy called Klaus. And Klaus is a really interesting, as a gardener, was like one of my best conversations I ever had with a gardener, because it really reminded me of working as a gardener. So, the first thing, Klaus is a guy who he's quite animated guy, and so he and I were really talking about it. And Klaus is on the ground all the time. So whereas Burckhardt has got GIS, he's basically got an illustrator drawing that's operating like GIS of the landscape with every single tree mapped on it. And he's working in relationship to Excel spreadsheets and to GIS information in relationship to time and staffing. Klaus is a gardener who's working on the ground all the time. So I'm looking at how each one of those protagonists looks differently at this thing. And so Klaus's approach, which I called watching and waiting, is really around the idea of that he learnt everything he learnt from the site as he's been working on site. And he talks about particular things. And so when he first comes in, he says, this is the key view. He's like, this is the key frame of the whole project. This is the Niederrhein, the classic Niederrhein view with the wetlands, with with occasional cultural objects within it, with poplars in the distance. this is the composed view. He says, this is the view that I maintain always in relationship to this point, because this locks into the most basic idea of what the original sense of Korte's vision was for that landscape. But that after that, he's working in much more different things. So from that, he said, I want to take you to the disaster area. And so here's Klaus wandering around. And Klaus, is a terribly intellectual kind of gardener. He describes this massive storm that blew through the garden recently. And so what he's really talked about was like 100 trees blew over in this place. And basically, unless the trees were in that space, he actually had he's got no time to do anything with them. And so part of his approach has to be, and this is a key thing, he has to work with what's emerging from this place. And so as a new dynamic as a whole opens up, he has to now start to manage the garden as a natural environment completely, because he can't afford to deal with it as a garden anymore, because it's now transgressed into something else. It's now a fully fledged, regenerating ecological environment. Now, luckily, his approach to gardening is ecological. Here's one of my favourite things that he says is, where at one point, he basically also talks about how to work at this site. When he was in the 80s, he's part of this sort of green movement in Germany. Now, he says that at that time, Germany was a pawn in the NATO network, and that there were all these nuclear launch sites in Europe, and he said, the rocket station next to the site was a place where he protested a lot against nuclear weapons. And so he says, coming back to the site, it's amazing. 30 years ago we were fighting about having rivers in concrete channels, and so he says the restoration of the river is part of his protest work. But then at the same time after that, he says, with my mind filled with an image of community environmental awareness, as we re-enter the meadow, I am shocked when Fischdick suddenly stops, his ears pricking up like a hunting dog's, and changing from English suddenly shouts in German at a couple who are photographing a plant by a stream to get off the path. He tells me, I am a misanthrope. I hate people, men, women. They destroy everything. They think it's just freedom. They just destroy nature. They see a flower, so you can see what he says. No one will ever see the photo. And so it just tells you also that thing that a gardener has about the ownership that a gardener has. And so this is very different from the kind of ownership that a landscape architect has. And so anyway, we wander through, and he talks to me about a few spots. And one of the spots he talks to me about with great pride is that in his way of working, obviously this area here is all about the tractor. And so that's, basically they're working with the tractor, and that's management of that tractor, but it's also about maintaining edges. But most of the gardening work he's involved with is around naturalization. And so what he's doing, as much as anything, is when he's doing a planting design, is he's naturalizing species in locations to create a particular planting design configuration. Because you can't put in a plant and then keep maintaining it. You have to put in a plant that's going to survive and thrive on its own. And so his interventions are all into existing ecologies. And that's a really interesting way to be working, because he's saying, I'm never going to fertilize it. And in fact, this is where we come back to another point that he talks about. I mean, that's one of Korte's things, but which is actually quite amazing as an idea about you've got a continuous planted buffer along here, and then you put in this grove of trees. On the one hand, it's continuous, and on the other hand, it's got this filtered space that you walk through it. I mean, it's more but we end up at this plant that's this part which is like a Udolph style garden, and Udolph comes there all the time. And so this is one of those moments where I think I'm going to give you something which you should think about writing down, because this is a really interesting thing which I don't think we've talked to you about, which is about the Dutch wave. Did I talk to you guys about the Dutch wave in planning design? But it's really important because the Dutch wave is a let me find it again where he's talking about it. Yeah. So, So yeah, so basically the approach that we're talking about, and this is key to what Fichte is about, is this guy called Henk Gerritsen. And Henk Gerritsen was part of the Dutch wave together with Piet Oudolf, and there's one other guy who I can't remember his name. And Gerritsen really theorized that in his essay on gardening. And the essay on gardening is a really important thing. And it's really also important because it gets to the reason why Oudolf's approach is so relevant right now. And so, for instance, you know, key to Gerritsen's approach is, letting time pass. And so, and so what he's talking, well, a lot of what he talks about is this idea about that the gardener makes a once-only intervention. You could say landscape architect makes a once-only intervention and then leans back to see what Mother Nature thinks of his ideal image. For this type of garden, Gerritsen foresees that one by one, the object of his love will get the shorter end of the stick or be supplanted by perennial herbs, grasses, perennial weeds, bushes, and finally trees. The natural succession, whichever it is in Europe, leads back to forest formation or climax. And so what he's arguing is that he says the gardener may as well have not started. And instead what Gerritsen talks about is a plant's ecological amplitude or range, which encompasses the conditions under which it will still grow. And so this is important because what he's saying is, and it's something I was taught in horticulture college, which is that you need to know where a plant's from and the ecological region it's from, or biota, so you can make a decision about whether it will, thrive. Mediterranean plant, etc., etc. And so this idea of ecological amplitude becomes a key decision-making idea, but it's just enough to survive. That's his key thing, not too much. So as I say, he argues for working with the minimum conditions of the plant rather than the maximum, because what he's about is using existing soil fertility, where less growth equals less maintenance. And so ironically for me, arguing for growth, this is quite a funny position to end up, because I've been arguing for growth, and the title of the book is Overgrown, when he's actually arguing for less growth to be able to ensure that the plant maintains its position within the system. So all the time, for instance, what he's working on wants is plants that will grow slowly and will grow small. And so he says, faced with the succession cycle, he says the most important trick is to keep maintenance to a minimum and is to limit fertility. Never add fertilizer, remove leaves or dead plants, and use compost sparingly. Now, this is a European thing, obviously, but it's an interesting thing. So, his rules are the uses of fertilizers and chemical herbicides is a sin. If you want to remove something, just weed it. Try to disturb the soil as little as possible. Be frugal with water and don't whinge. And he says this is because gardens are by definition dynamic environments, and due to constant interventions, the natural succession is constantly interrupted. Therefore, gardens are a paradise for rampant plants and a source of desperation. So in other words, whenever you make a garden, you're actually creating disturbance. So this is an interesting dynamic also in relationship to maintenance and why you might end up with mass planting, because you're actually creating a situation where nothing will be changed. Okay, so those are the main chapters. And so as we can see, I've worked from figuring growth, working from a drawn or a design-based process into a maintenance-based process. And so I'm finally just going to give you in the conclusion, we'll quickly look at these, but you can read them yourself. And so in the conclusion, I basically present what I refer to as a manifesto for the Viridic, where I try to make some key principles. And so the first principle is that the Viridic makes plant and designer equals. And I say utilizing the Viridic involves breaking the subject-object split between human and plant. Instead, both are in an intersubjective relationship in the garden. Treating the Viridic as a relationship embeds landscape architecture in the growth of the landscape as a subject. And this is where I think to some extent design practice is a distancing act. But in actual fact, the landscape connections that we work with are always intimate in some sense. Landscape is one of the most evocative things around. If we're in the process of trying to maintain a kind of objective distance from it, then what are we engaging it with? The next one is, plant material as growth in the Viridic. And so this is something I've discussed quite a lot, so I won't go into it very much, but it's the idea that plant material, that growth is the material itself, not the plant, essentially. Maintenance must be explicit in landscape design with the Viridic, which is to say that maintenance can't just be assumed. Maintenance has to be factored in. It has to be a major part of the design process, and we have to develop new representational modes and practices to allow us to work with maintenance. That's the biggest practical challenge out of the PhD. Regulate and accept the environment to cultivate Viridic qualities. A Viridic practice of landscape design with gardening involves treating designed and maintained spaces first as an ecology, but one that is tailored to the particular formal and material qualities that interest the designer. From the opposite direction, it also means potentially fostering aesthetic qualities by manipulating the ecology of the environment by utilising design to regulate ecological systems. Next one, the Viridic is about energy. Now, something I didn't mention before is around from Dutton's garden is that thermodynamics is ultimately the name of the relationship in the garden, which is the relationship between energy moving in, energy changing form, energy being put into things. That is ultimately the thing you're working with, is energy in this system. Actions trigger latent effects in the Viridic. That's to say that ultimately you're always working with something else when you're working with the Viridic. You're working with the bud that hasn't shot yet. You're working with the DNA in the plant that you'll never really know what it is. You're working with erosion, as we discussed last time. The Viridic is an indirect language. You do something now, it causes an effect later. That's a key aspect of it. The Viridic is form and process simultaneously, which is something we've discussed, and biology and aesthetics are not separate in the Viridic, and I think we've discussed that. The Viridic is about action rather than representation, and we've discussed that, which is it's about real-time activity and understanding that things happen in real time and not believing or trusting the control that we have in representations. The Viridic is a learning practice, as I've said, which is that ultimately that you actually learn from what you do because the plant responds to your actions. So the next time you see it, something's changed. So inherently you're learning from what's already happening to that plant when you're working with it. And the Viridic merges gardening and design thinking. Man, I had more of these than I realised. The Viridic uses gardening as a feedback tool, and the Viridic entails, I think this is the last one, a change in practice from the landscape architect to the gardener. And that is my motherfucking book.